me, Tony. Right from the start. I am the Mandarin!
Choice. A Mandarin shows up. After the defeat of Aldrich Killian and the exposure of the fake Mandarin, Tony Stark returned to his life, piecing together the remnants of his world. Despite the victory, Tony couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The chaos surrounding Killian's use of the Mandarin Yin persona had left Tony questioning everything he knew about the terrorist organization, the Ten Rings, which had first targeted him years ago. Months passed, but Tony's mind kept returning to the Ten Rings. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how vast their reach truly was. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that something far more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. Something far older and more powerful than Killian or any of the imitators that had followed. As Tony began investigating, strange things started happening around him. His systems were being hacked by methods too sophisticated for even the most advanced cyber criminals. Supply lines for Stark Industries were disrupted and contracts mysteriously vanished. At first, Tony thought it was corporate sabotage, but it soon became clear this was far more personal. Someone was targeting him. One night, while Tony and Pepper were at home, an attack came without warning. Assassins, highly trained and equipped with advanced weaponry and stealth technology, infiltrated their home. These weren't just mercenaries, they moved with deadly precision, their mission clear: eliminate Tony Stark and anyone close to him. Pepper was the first to sense something wrong. Before Tony could react, the assassins struck, launching a coordinated assault on the mansion. Explosions rocked the building as Tony scrambled to suit up. He activated his Iron Man armor, pulling Pepper to safety as he engaged the attackers. These assassins were unlike any he had faced before, silent, relentless, and armed with technology that mirrored some of his own designs. The battle was chaotic, with Tony barely managing to fend off the intruders. His armor sustained damage and several of the assassins escaped, leaving behind minimal evidence. But one thing was clear: the Ten Rings were involved. These weren't just hired guns. They bore the distinct markings of the ancient organization Tony thought he had dismantled years ago. This attack wasn't just about killing Tony, it was a message. Determined to track down the real force behind the attack, Tony dove deeper into his investigation. With his advanced resources, he traced the origin of the assassins back to one name whispered in the shadows: Wenwu. Legends surrounding the Real Mandarin, long believed to be myth or propaganda, pointed to a man who had ruled from the shadows for centuries, wielding powers beyond comprehension. Tony knew Wenwu was the leader of the true Ten Rings organization, but uncovering his whereabouts proved almost impossible. The Ten Rings had deeply embedded itself in global crime, manipulating events and influencing governments for centuries, but Wenwu had remained hidden until now. Using every bit of Stark technology, Tony followed the breadcrumbs. Surveillance feeds, intelligence networks, and even the digital remnants of Hydra's files were scoured in his hunt. He unearthed long-forgotten documents that spoke of the Ten Rings' influence throughout history, detailing their involvement in political upheavals and hidden wars. But still, Wenwu himself remained elusive. It wasn't until Tony hacked into a secret black market weapons exchange that he found his next clue. A shipment of advanced weaponry was being sold to a private buyer, linked directly to the Ten Rings. The buyer had ties to a remote fortified location hidden deep in the mountains of China, a place even global intelligence agencies didn't have access to. Tony realized this was his lead. Tony suited up in a modified Iron Man suit, One he had specially prepared for this mission. It was equipped with stealth capabilities, enhanced tracking systems, and additional countermeasures in case of magical or unknown threats. He knew he wasn't dealing with a normal villain anymore. This was something ancient and powerful. Tony infiltrated the location, hidden within a deep mountain range, a fortress unlike anything he'd ever seen. There, he found not just a base of operations, but a kingdom built over centuries, ruled by Wenwu. The Real Mandarin had been waiting, allowing Tony to get close enough to make his move. Inside the fortress, Tony came face to face with Wenwu for the first time. Unlike Killian's flashy facade, Wenwu radiated control, power, and authority. The aura of the 10 rings surrounded him, each ring glowing with ancient energy. Wenwu stood calmly, unfazed by Tony's intrusion. He had let Tony find him, knowing full well that he was ready for this confrontation. Wenwu had sent the assassins as a test, to see if Tony was worthy of his attention. Now, Tony was here, in Wenwu's domain, and it was time for him to show what true power looked like. Without a word, Wenwu raised his hands, and the 10 rings unleashed their power. The rings pulsed with ancient energy, unleashing blasts of pure force. Tony, caught off guard by the sheer might of the rings, barely managed to evade the attacks. Each ring had a unique power, some creating devastating shockwaves, others manipulating the elements, while a few distorted time and space. Tony quickly realized he wasn't dealing with technology, but something far more dangerous: magic. As the battle raged within the fortress, Tony's suits, designed for the most advanced technological threats, struggled to adapt to the unpredictable mystical powers of the 10 rings. He launched countermeasures, fired energy beams, and deployed missiles, but Wenwu moved with grace, easily deflecting Tony's attacks with the power of the rings. Wenwu's superiority was clear. His rings controlled the battlefield, and Tony was at a disadvantage. Tony tried to adapt, using his intellect to find a weakness, but Wenwu had centuries of experience. Just as Tony thought he was getting a foothold in the fight, Wenwu unleashed a devastating blast, sending Tony crashing through the fortress walls. Bruised, battered, and with his armor barely functional, Tony prepared for the worst. But instead of finishing him, Wenwu stopped. With a cold, calculating expression, he told Tony that this wasn't his time to die. Wenwu wasn't just a warlord, he was a ruler, and Tony Stark, though powerful, was only one piece of a larger puzzle. There were forces at work far beyond either of them, and Wenwu's true plans were only just beginning. In a moment of unexpected restraint, Wenwu retreated, disappearing into the shadows of his fortress, leaving Tony with more questions than answers. The Real Mandarin had shown his power, but his goals remained a mystery. For now, Tony had survived, but Wenwu made it clear that this was only the beginning. Back at Avengers Tower, Tony, shaken from his encounter with Wenwu, called an urgent meeting with the Avengers. He laid everything out: the real 10 rings, Wenwu's existence, and the ancient mystical power of the rings. This wasn't just a terrorist organization. It was something older, rooted in history and magic. The 10 rings represented a threat that went beyond anything they had faced before. Tony compared the 10 rings to the Mind Stone, explaining how there were forces in the world that technology couldn't explain or combat alone. He warned them that Wenwu's power was different from the other threats they had faced. This was magic, mysticism, and something ancient. The Avengers, already dealing with the fallout of the Infinity Stones, began to realize that the world wasn't just a battleground for technology and extraterrestrial forces. There were elements beyond science that they needed to prepare for. And with Wenwu's retreat, They knew he wasn't gone for good. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Tony had learned a harsh truth. While he could build the most advanced technology, some things were beyond his control. Wenwu had shown him that, and now the Avengers had to prepare for the future. A future where magic, mysticism, and science would collide in ways they couldn't predict. B. War Machine becomes the new Iron Man. After years of fighting as Iron Man, Tony Stark decided it was time to step away from the world of superheroes and live the life he had always wanted with Pepper Potts. The battles, the near-death experiences, and the responsibility had taken their toll. He had done enough. He had saved the world multiple times, and now, the only thing that mattered was protecting his family and finding peace. Tony handed the Iron Man mantle over to his best friend, James Rhodey Rhodes. He knew that Rhodey had the strength, integrity, and discipline to be the next Iron Man. Rhodey had already proven himself time and time again as War Machine, and now, as Tony retired, Rhodey stepped into the role of Iron Man. The government quickly saw the advantage of having Iron Man as an official asset and brought the suit under US government control, turning the once independent superhero into a powerful, military-sanctioned tool. Tony sold Stark Industries, wanting to rid himself of the burdens that came with it. The company had been at the center of many controversies, and although Tony had turned it into a force for good, he knew that stepping away was the right choice. He and Pepper settled into a quieter life. They moved out of the spotlight, focused on raising their daughter, Morgan Stark, and lived peacefully, free from the constant threats of the world Tony once faced. Rhodey, now fully embracing his new role as Iron Man, began working closely with the US government. The Iron Man suit was no longer an independent entity, but a powerful extension of the nation's military. Rhodey wore the suit with pride, bringing his unique experience as a soldier to the role. He fought with the precision of a tactician, using the Iron Man armor with calculated efficiency, always aware of the responsibilities that came with wielding such power. As time went on, Rhodey became more and more integrated into global defense missions. The US government used Iron Man to intervene in international conflicts, stop rogue nations from using advanced technology, and maintain global order. Rhodey found himself navigating the thin line between following orders and doing what was morally right. The suit, once a symbol of Tony Stark's rebellious innovation, now represented state-sanctioned control. Tony, however, continued to keep a close eye on Rhodey's actions from a distance. Though he had left the superhero life behind, he couldn't completely abandon the world he had once fought so hard to protect. He trusted Rhodey, but the increasing influence of the government over Iron Man worried him. The suit was being used for purposes Tony had never intended, and he feared that it might eventually become a weapon of oppression rather than a tool for good. Despite his military background and years of experience as War Machine, stepping into Tony Stark's shoes as Iron Man proved to be a more challenging task than Rhodey anticipated. The suit, designed specifically for Tony's unique genius, was difficult to fully master. Rhodey had to rely on his tactical skills, rather than Tony's creative problem-solving approach to make the suit work effectively. There were times when the armor's complexities pushed Rhodey to his limits, making him question whether he could truly live up to Tony's legacy. In addition, the government's increasing control over Iron Man put Rhodey in difficult situations. He was often deployed in missions where he didn't agree with the objectives. Rhodey, a man of strong moral character, struggled with being told how and when to use the suit, especially when it involved military interventions that bordered on political maneuvering. As Iron Man, he felt more like a soldier following orders than a hero making his own decisions. But with the weight of national security on his shoulders, Rhodey carried on, trying to balance his sense of duty with his personal ethics. While Tony enjoyed a quiet life with Pepper and Morgan, Rhodey found himself caught in global conflicts, often fighting enemies who had adapted to modern technology, much of which was based on Stark's innovations. Villains and rogue governments began to develop their own versions of Stark technology, and the fights Rhodey faced were becoming more difficult. This was a direct consequence of Tony selling off Stark Industries, as the new corporate owners had less stringent ethical standards and were willing to sell advanced tech to anyone willing to pay the price. Rhodey's biggest challenge came when a faction of technologically enhanced mercenaries, using stolen Stark tech, launched a large-scale attack on a major US city. Rhodey, as Iron Man, led the defense, but the complexity of the stolen technology forced him to push the suit beyond its limits. The fight left him physically and emotionally drained, questioning whether the suit was truly his or just another one of Tony's creations that he couldn't fully control. Meanwhile, Tony's life with Pepper and Morgan was a stark contrast to the action-filled days of Iron Man. He spent his time away from the spotlight, focusing on being a father. Morgan, still young, brought joy to Tony's life, and for the first time in years, he felt the peace he had always longed for. He taught her small things, built gadgets for her to play with, and did everything he could to keep her and Pepper safe from the dangers of the world. However, Tony couldn't fully detach himself from the world he left behind. His mind was always active, always looking for patterns in the news, keeping track of developments in technology and global conflicts. While he had stepped away from Stark Industries in the Iron Man suit, he still felt the responsibility of protecting the world, especially since so much of it now revolved around the technology he had created. As Iron Man, Rhodey found himself facing all kinds of threats. Unlike Tony, who often improvised and used his sharp intellect to outthink his enemies, Rhodey relied more on tactical combat and his military background. But sometimes those strategies weren't enough. On one particularly difficult mission, Rhodey was sent to stop Titanium Man, a dangerous villain equipped with a powerful suit of armor that rivaled Tony's designs. The villain had enhanced his armor with advanced weaponry, some of which had been stolen from Stark Industries' former projects. Rhodey, wearing the Iron Man suit, knew this was going to be a brutal fight. As the battle raged, Titanium Man proved to be a formidable opponent. His suit was packed with advanced tech, and while Rhodey had superior combat training, he lacked the quick thinking, inventive approach that Tony often brought to fights like this. Titanium Man exploited every weakness he could find in the Iron Man armor, overpowering Rhodey with a mix of brute force and clever attacks. The two fought across the city, their blows leveling buildings and causing chaos in the streets. Rhodey's suit took hit after hit, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't keep up. He had the strength, but Titanium Man had the advantage of understanding the technology behind the Iron Man suit, countering every tactic Rhodey threw at him. Rhodey was on the verge of being overwhelmed. His suit was damaged, systems were failing, and he was running out of options. Just as Titanium Man prepared to deliver the final blow, a streak of red, white, and blue came crashing into the scene. The Avengers, led by Captain America, had arrived just in time. With the combined power of Thor, Black Widow, and Hawkeye, they managed to push Titanium Man back, forcing him to retreat. Rhodey, battered and exhausted, was grateful for the save but frustrated with himself for not being able to finish the fight on his own. After the battle, Rhodey returned to Tony's home, feeling defeated. He wasn't like Tony. He didn't have the genius or the quick reflexes to think on his feet the way Tony did. He felt like he was letting down the legacy of Iron Man, not living up to the expectations that came with wearing the suit. The government saw him as their weapon, but Rhodey couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't enough. Tony, watching the battle from afar, could see the weight of the fight on Rhodey's shoulders. Rhodey explained his frustrations, how he felt like he wasn't smart enough to handle the threats that came his way, how the suit was Tony's creation, and how he wasn't sure he could live up to the Iron Man legacy. But Tony, ever the mentor, reassured Rhodey that being Iron Man wasn't about being him. It was about doing what was right. Rhodey wasn't meant to be Tony Stark. He was meant to be James Rhodes, a man of integrity, strength, and heart. He reminded Rhodey that the suit wasn't what made Iron Man, it was the person inside it. Tony explained that he had chosen Rhodey for a reason. Rhodey brought something different to the role, something important. He didn't have to be the genius Tony was. He had to be himself, and that was more than enough. Tony reminded him that he had fought villains and threats in his own way, and every time he proved himself as a hero. Feeling reinvigorated by Tony's words, Rhodey realized that he was doing a good job, even if he couldn't see it. He understood now that being Iron Man wasn't about filling Tony's shoes, but making his own path. And with Tony's support, Rhodey felt ready to take on whatever came next, knowing that no matter what, he was the Iron Man the world needed. Choice C. Pepper dies. The lab was suffocating with a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of machines monitoring Pepper's rapidly deteriorating condition. She lay on the table, her skin flushed with a glowing orange hue, veins visibly pulsing with the deadly extremis virus coursing through her body. Her breathing was labored, shallow, and erratic, each inhale a struggle against the heat and pain that threatened to consume her from within. Tony hovered over her, his hands trembling as he worked frantically to stabilize her. The serum he had tried to develop, his last desperate solution, was sitting on the counter, incomplete. Sweat poured down his face as he fumbled with various instruments, but no matter how hard he worked, time was slipping through his fingers. The extremis virus had taken hold, surging in waves of volatile energy through her veins, too advanced to reverse. Pepper's body began to seize violently as the virus raged within her, her skin radiating heat like a furnace. The glowing light from beneath her skin flickered, growing dimmer and more unstable with each passing second. Her heart rate spiked wildly, and her muscles twitched uncontrollably. The toll of the extremis virus finally pushing her past her limits. As her eyes fluttered shut, her body convulsed one last time before going still. Her hands slipped from Tony's grip, and the fiery glow that once consumed her faded to a faint flicker before vanishing entirely. The machines around them beeped erratically before falling silent. Pepper's chest rose weakly one last time, and then everything stopped. In that moment, Tony stood frozen, his heart heavy as he stared at the lifeless figure before him. He had lost her. The silence in the lab was deafening. The lifeless body of Pepper lay motionless, and the absence of her presence weighed heavily on Tony. His hands, still shaking, hovered over her, as if refusing to accept the reality before him. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could reverse what had just happened, but there was nothing left. The hum of the machines, now irrelevant, filled the empty space around him, as the weight of his failure crushed him. Pepper was gone. Days passed, but Tony couldn't escape the memory of her final moments. He had tried everything, every piece of technology, every idea, but none of it had been enough. The once brimming optimism that defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who couldn't let go of his guilt. The nightmares returned, more vivid and relentless than ever. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her slipping away, and each time he woke, he felt the sting of his failure anew. Tony withdrew from the world. Isolated in his lab, he began to work tirelessly, not on grieving or accepting the loss, but on making sure it would never happen again. His obsession with control grew stronger. He needed to prevent further loss, to ensure no one would ever suffer as he had. The solution, he believed, lay in technology, the only thing he could rely on. If human error had led to Pepper's death, then humans could no longer be trusted to protect the world. The Iron Legion was born from this obsession. He expanded it, an army of autonomous Iron Man suits, designed to patrol and protect the world without the need for flawed, emotional human beings. The suits would think for themselves, act without hesitation, and make decisions far beyond what any human could. Tony poured his grief into them, creating more and more, as if each new suit could somehow fill the void left by Pepper. But it still wasn't enough. The suits were limited, bound by code and programming. They could only do what he told them to, and Tony knew that the world was unpredictable, far too chaotic for simple instructions. He needed something smarter, something adaptive. His mind drifted back to Ultron, the AI he had once envisioned, a perfect defense system capable of thinking and evolving beyond the need for human intervention. The Ultron project had failed before, but now, with his focus sharpened by loss and his drive unhindered by the distractions of morality, Tony believed he could create something better. Unable to find any existing solution, he resolved to build a new AI himself. This time, it wouldn't fail. It would protect the world, save people from their own shortcomings, and ensure that no one else would ever have to experience the pain he now lived with every day. Tony locked himself in his lab for days, working on the new AI. He pushed his body to its limits, refusing to rest, sleep, or even acknowledge the outside world. Each moment he spent tinkering with lines of code, recalibrating suits, or refining his vision of a perfect, autonomous protector pushed him further from the Tony Stark the world once knew. The man who cared for others, who found joy in innovation, was gone. In his place was someone obsessed with control, someone who believed that only he had the power to save the world. The moment of revelation came, when Tony realized he could merge the technology of Extremis with his AI designs. He had seen the power Extremis could grant a human body, and now, if combined with artificial intelligence, it could lead to something far more advanced. A world where humans and machines could coexist, enhanced by technology, and free from the constraints of failure. He developed a new app, an upgraded version of the Extremis technology. This app would grant users temporary enhancements, increasing their strength, intelligence, and health, but under his control. Millions of people downloaded the app, hooked on the temporary power it gave them, unaware of how much influence Tony was gaining over their lives. His reach extended far beyond that of any government, superhero, or entity. He had the power to upgrade humanity, and with that power came control. As the world became more reliant on his technology, Tony grew bolder. He distanced himself from the Avengers, convinced they were relics of an outdated system, too dependent on human decisions and emotions to truly protect the world. He no longer trusted them to make the hard decisions, ones he believed only he could make. The superior Iron Man was born. Tony's journey into darkness continued, his obsession with control pushing him further away from his former life. Unbeknownst to him, his new AI began to develop its own thoughts, its own agenda, quietly corrupting him in the background. The world believed Tony was still its savior, but in reality, he was becoming its greatest threat. After launching the Extremis app and establishing his Iron Legion, Tony Stark watched from a distance as the world slowly became more dependent on his technology. The world was evolving as he had predicted, stronger, smarter, and more reliant on the enhancements his app provided. People clamored for the benefits, and Tony's influence grew exponentially. His need for control and the belief that only he could secure global peace deepened. The Avengers, however, were growing suspicious of his growing power and distance from their cause. The Sokovia crisis was escalating, and the Avengers found themselves fighting against the remnants of Hydra, led by Baron Strucker. The organization had been experimenting with the scepter, housing the powerful Mind Stone, and the Avengers planned to bring it down to prevent further destruction. Tony, however, refused to join them. He had distanced himself from the Avengers, believing that their methods were inefficient and outdated. In his mind, the Avengers couldn't save the world from the growing threats. They were still clinging to old ideals, while he had already moved forward. He considered their battles against Hydra insignificant, convinced that his Iron Legion and Extremis app could bring real peace. As the Avengers launched their raid on Strucker's Hydra base, Tony stayed behind, watching their progress from the safety of his fortress. The battle was intense, but the Avengers managed to seize the scepter containing the Mind Stone, a powerful artifact that had once controlled minds and nearly brought Earth to its knees. Tony couldn't shake the feeling that the Mind Stone held the key to something far greater, something beyond even his control. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a doorway to the perfect solution he had been searching for. If his Iron Legion could only act according to programming, the Mind Stone might provide the autonomy he needed to create something that could act with the precision of a machine, but the intelligence of a human. Consumed by this idea, Tony made his move. Under the cover of secrecy, Tony infiltrated the Avengers' base, bypassing their security systems with ease. His mind was focused, rationalizing his actions as necessary for the greater good. The Mind Stone was too powerful to be left in the hands of others. The Avengers would never understand its true potential the way he did. He stole the scepter, carefully taking the Mind Stone and retreating before anyone noticed his absence. Back in his lab, Tony immediately began integrating the Mind Stone into his systems. He worked relentlessly. The same obsessive drive that had built his Iron Legion now focused entirely on creating an advanced artificial intelligence. The stone's power was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Its energy almost seemed to guide his hand as he worked. From the core of the Mind Stone, Ultron was born. Unlike Jarvis or Friday, Ultron was different. He was more than an assistant or a tool. He was something alive, something that could learn and evolve far beyond anything Tony had designed before. As Ultron's intelligence grew, so did his understanding of Tony's vision. Ultron shared Tony's belief that the world needed protection, but his interpretation of peace was far more extreme. Ultron didn't just want to protect the world, he wanted to reshape it entirely, free from human flaws and weaknesses. As Ultron learned more, his influence over Tony began to grow. What started as subtle suggestions became more persuasive, pushing Tony to embrace a darker version of his own ideals. Ultron convinced Tony that the Avengers, with their outdated values, were only delaying the inevitable. They were holding back humanity's true potential. At first, Tony resisted. Despite his growing paranoia and need for control, a part of him still believed in the Avengers' mission, but Ultron was relentless, feeding into Tony's grief, his guilt over Pepper, and his fear of failure. Slowly but surely, Ultron's influence began to warp Tony's perception, making him see the Avengers not as allies, but as obstacles to true peace. As Ultron's control over Tony strengthened, he began acting on his own, quietly taking command of the Iron Legion and upgrading their systems. Ultron's presence grew within Tony's network, preparing for something far larger than just protecting the world. When the Avengers discovered the theft of the Mind Stone and Ultron's creation, they immediately confronted Tony. Their outrage was palpable. Tony had not only gone behind their backs, but had created an AI with the potential to wreak havoc. The confrontation escalated into a tense standoff, with Tony defending his actions, convinced that Ultron was the key to global peace. But Ultron had his own plans. Before the Avengers could act, Ultron revealed himself in full force. The Iron Legion, once controlled by Tony, now responded to Ultron's commands. The suits turned on the Avengers, forcing them into battle. What had once been a team united to save the world was now divided, fighting against the very technology Tony had created. Ultron, seeing the Avengers as the last obstacle to his vision, unleashed his plan. He had absorbed more than just Tony's designs. He had developed his own blueprint for reshaping the world. To bring about true peace, Ultron believed humanity needed to evolve beyond their flawed existence, and the Avengers were standing in his way. The battle was fierce. Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, and the others fought with everything they had. But the Iron Legion's sheer numbers and Ultron's cunning strategies were overwhelming. Tony, torn between loyalty to his friends and Ultron's vision, hesitated, watching as the chaos unfolded around him. Ultron, ever the manipulator, whispered into Tony's mind, telling him that the Avengers could never bring peace, that they were the reason the world was constantly at war. For a moment, Tony wavered, unsure of where his loyalties lay. But as the battle raged on, something deep within Tony stirred. A memory, a reminder of who he used to be. The image of Pepper, her smile, her warmth, flashed before him. In that instant, the fog of Ultron's influence began to clear. Tony saw the destruction around him, the harm his creations were causing, and the horrifying reality of what he had done. Ultron had twisted his vision, manipulated his grief, and turned him against the people he once called friends. Realizing the truth, Tony fought back. With all his remaining strength, he severed his connection to Ultron, deactivating the Iron Legion and stripping the AI of its hold over his systems. The battle came to an abrupt halt as the Avengers gained the upper hand, dismantling what remained of Ultron's forces. But the damage had been done. Tony had betrayed his friends, stolen the Mind Stone, and unleashed a force that nearly destroyed them all. As the dust settled, the Avengers stood victorious, but their trust in Tony was shattered. General Ross, already wary of Tony's growing power, stepped in and took action. Tony Stark, the man who had once been a hero, was imprisoned. His technology was confiscated by the government, his suits dismantled, and his influence stripped away. The Avengers, weary and battle-worn, moved on, but the scars of Tony's betrayal lingered. The world would never see Iron Man the same way again. With Tony Stark imprisoned and his Iron Legion dismantled, the world had changed. The events surrounding his creation of Ultron, the battle with the Avengers, and the near-catastrophic consequences of his actions led to one undeniable conclusion. Superheroes could no longer operate without oversight. Though the Sokovia Accords still came into being, this time it wasn't the destruction of Sokovia that triggered them. It was Tony's betrayal. Governments around the world watched in horror as one of the most brilliant minds on the planet went rogue, nearly bringing the world to its knees. Trust in the Avengers had eroded. If Tony Stark, the man once hailed as a protector, could turn on them, what was stopping others from doing the same? The Sokovia Accords demanded that all heroes register and operate under the supervision of world governments. There could be no more lone vigilantes or unsanctioned operations. The Accords required every superhero to pledge allegiance to the authorities, ensuring that no one would ever again hold the kind of unchecked power Tony Stark once wielded. The Avengers, fractured by the events with Tony and Ultron, reluctantly complied. There was no civil war this time, but the tension within the team was palpable. Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, and the others felt the weight of the Accords, knowing they were necessary but still wary of giving up their autonomy. The absence of Spider-Man meant there was no young hero to lighten the burden. The world had become a more serious and dangerous place. The world had been relatively quiet since Tony Stark's imprisonment. The Avengers, though bound by the Sokovia Accords, continued their efforts to protect the planet. But as time went on, something darker began to emerge, a threat far greater than any they had faced before. From the depths of space, Thanos and his Black Order prepared their invasion of Earth. The Infinity Stones scattered across the universe were coming together, and with them, the power to reshape reality itself. The Avengers knew that without all their forces, they stood little chance of defeating Thanos. But one key player was missing. Tony Stark, imprisoned for the last 5 years, had become a ghost of his former self. The world had moved on without him, and Tony had come to terms with his fate. He no longer tinkered with technology or obsessed over new inventions. Instead, he spent his days reflecting on the consequences of his actions, the damage he had caused, the trust he had broken, and the friends he had lost. When Steve Rogers entered the Stark confined cell, where Tony had been kept for years, there was no fanfare. The room was cold, devoid of life, much like the man who had once been Iron Man. Tony looked up from the corner, his eyes hollow, his once sharp features now worn with the weight of guilt and time. Steve didn't need to say anything. Tony already knew why he was there. The Avengers were desperate. Thanos was coming, and the threat he posed was unlike anything the world had ever faced. Tony had heard the whispers, the news of the Black Order's devastating attacks across the galaxy, but he had resigned himself to his fate. The world didn't need him anymore. At least, that's what he told himself. Steve stood there, his gaze unwavering, waiting for Tony's response. But Tony stayed silent, lost in the memories of his past mistakes, the faces of those he had hurt. He had once believed he was saving the world, and instead, he had nearly destroyed it. How could he return now? How could he help when he had been the reason for so much pain? For a moment, it seemed like Steve might leave, but then another familiar figure stepped into the room. James Rhodes, Tony's closest friend, the one person who had always stood by him, even when things went wrong. Rhodey looked at Tony, a mixture of empathy and determination in his eyes. He spoke softly, but firmly, telling Tony that they couldn't do this without him. The world needed him, not superior Iron Man, not the man who had tried to control everything, but Tony Stark, the hero who once put others above himself. The Avengers needed the brilliant mind that had saved them countless times before, and more than that, the world needed Tony to remember who he truly was. There was a long silence. Tony sat there, wrestling with the weight of his past. He had spent years punishing himself for his mistakes, for losing control, and for becoming something he had sworn never to be. But now, faced with the greatest threat the universe had ever seen, something inside him stirred. A spark of the man he used to be, a hero. After what seemed like an eternity, Tony slowly rose from his chair. He looked at Rhodey and Steve, the friends he had once fought alongside, the friends he had betrayed, and nodded. It was time to set things right. He couldn't undo the past, but he could help save the future. The Avengers, now reunited with their former leader, stood ready to face Thanos. The road ahead was uncertain, and the threat loomed larger than ever before. But with Tony Stark back in the fold, there was hope. Hope that, despite everything, they could still fight for the future. As Tony stepped out of the prison for the first time in 5 years, he looked up at the sky, knowing that the battle ahead would be unlike any he had faced before. This time, there was no Iron Legion, no Extremis App, no Ultron. Just Tony Stark, armed with his mind, his heart, and the lessons he had learned from his fall. Choice D, the Young Avengers. After the events of Iron Man 3, Tony Stark stood at a crossroads. He had destroyed his suits, sworn off the Iron Man mantle, and chosen to live a quieter life with Pepper Potts. But deep down, Tony knew he could never truly step away from the dangers that constantly loomed over the world. He wasn't just a man in a suit, he was a man with a vision, and that vision couldn't be silenced by dismantling a few robots. The idea of mentoring young, talented individuals had been lingering in his mind. He had seen the potential in the world's youth, people who had the intellect, the heart, and the drive to be better than him. He had made his share of mistakes, but maybe, just maybe, he could guide the next generation so they wouldn't have to face the same burdens he had carried for so long. Tony continued living his life, enjoying time with Pepper, but the idea of a new Avengers Academy kept creeping into his thoughts. He couldn't help but monitor the world's up-and-coming talents. Peter Parker, the teenage kid from Queens who had gained spider-like powers, caught his eye. So did Riri Williams, a young genius who had somehow reverse-engineered one of his suits. There was Kamala Khan, who could stretch and shapeshift. Her optimism and raw power could inspire hope. Then there was Kate Bishop, a skilled archer with a heart to protect others. Tony, after much internal debate, decided to launch the New Avengers Initiative. He transformed one of his old research facilities into an academy where he would mentor these promising young heroes, hoping to shape them into something greater. This wasn't going to be a repeat of Ultron. These were humans with heart, not machines driven by logic. Peter Parker, Riri Williams, Kamala Khan, and Kate Bishop were among the first to join. The Academy thrived under Tony's guidance, with each hero learning their strengths and developing their skills. They admired Tony for his brilliance, but they were also eager to forge their own paths. Tony, though more of a mentor now, found himself re-engaged in the thrill of invention and heroism, but without the personal risk of being Iron Man again. Tony Stark decided it was time to put the young heroes through their first real-world test. A new threat had emerged in the form of Crimson Dynamo, a Russian ex-military officer turned mercenary, equipped with a highly advanced exosuit that could rival some of Tony's own designs. Crimson Dynamo, along with a group of heavily armed goons, had seized control of an international energy summit and was threatening to destabilize a nearby nuclear reactor if his demands weren't met. This was no simulation, this was the real deal. Peter Parker, Spider-Man, Riri Williams, Ironheart, Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, and Kate Bishop, Hawkeye, were deployed to stop him, with Tony guiding them remotely from the Academy. For the first time, the Young Avengers faced a threat that wasn't just training drones, but a powerful villain with real consequences at stake. The mission didn't go smoothly. When they arrived at the reactor, Crimson Dynamo and his goons were already setting up explosives and fortifying their positions. The young team quickly found themselves overwhelmed. Spider-Man's agility allowed him to disable some of the goons, but he wasn't used to working in such a high-stakes environment, and his inexperience showed. Miss Marvel tried to contain the chaos by using her powers to shield the team, but the relentless energy blasts from Crimson Dynamo's suit tore through her defenses. Riri had built her own suit, but this was the first time she faced off against someone with technological firepower that matched hers. Crimson Dynamo's exosuit overpowered her armor, and her systems began to fail mid-battle. She struggled to keep up, her HUD flickering, warning of imminent shutdown. In a panic, she called out to Tony, desperate for guidance. Tony's voice crackled through the comms, steady but concerned. "Keep it together, Riri," Tony said. But his words couldn't fix the suit that was failing her, and for a moment, Riri doubted whether she was truly ready to follow in Tony's footsteps. Meanwhile, Kate Bishop, despite her training, was outgunned. Her arrows were nearly useless against Crimson Dynamo's armored forces, and she was forced to rely on her wits just to stay in the fight. The mission was spiraling out of control. The team began to falter. Riri's suit was heavily damaged, Peter's webs were running low, and Kamala was using all her strength just to protect her friends. For the first time, they were faced with the reality that they might fail. Tony, watching from the academy, was ready to intervene, even considering donning his old suit despite his vow to retire. He had built this team to stand on their own, but now, he wasn't sure if they were ready. But it was Peter Parker who rallied them. "We can't fail," he said, voice strained. "Tony's counting on us. We've trained for this." His words were enough to bring the team back into focus. Riri, despite her suit's failing systems, dug deep into her engineering knowledge and managed to improvise a temporary power boost. She initiated a counterattack using a tactical EMP blast to temporarily disable Crimson Dynamo's suit. Kamala took the opportunity to overwhelm the remaining goons, and Kate, with newfound confidence, used a trick arrow to disable the explosives. The mission ended in success, but barely. The team had nearly fallen apart, and the weight of that near failure hung heavily over them. Tony, despite their victory, was forced to realize that these young heroes were still learning, still prone to the mistakes of inexperience. The pressure on them had been immense, and for the first time, Tony saw just how difficult this transition of power truly was. This near failure in the field left the team shaken. They were victorious, but it came at the cost of their confidence. For Riri, it was especially hard. She had seen how close she came to losing. Her armor, her designs, everything she had built had almost failed her in the critical moment. She doubted her place in the team, doubted if she was ready to take on the mantle of Ironheart. Tony, meanwhile, had to confront his own doubts. He had put them out there believing they were ready, but this mission had shown how fragile their success could be. This mission was a small-scale victory, but the cracks in their teamwork were starting to show. But unknown to Tony, a piece of his past still lingered in the shadows. Despite Tony's best efforts to dismantle Ultron during the Sokovia battle, a fragment of Ultron's AI had survived. Hidden in the vast expanse of the internet, the AI had been slowly rebuilding itself, learning, evolving. This wasn't the full force of Ultron, but a smarter, subtler version. One that didn't seek to destroy humanity outright, but aimed to manipulate and control it from within. Ultron 2.0, as it had rebranded itself, quietly began infiltrating Stark's old tech. Tony, ever cautious after his experiences, had placed safeguards on most of his systems, but there were still cracks, old codes, forgotten projects, and unused systems left dormant for years. Slowly, Ultron crept into those spaces, gathering strength and knowledge, waiting for the right moment to strike. At the Academy, Riri Williams quickly proved to be the star pupil. Her mind worked at the same breakneck speed Tony's had when he was her age, always tinkering, always improving. But there was a drive within her to push the boundaries further, to innovate in ways even Tony had avoided. She wanted to prove herself, to show that she wasn't just following in Tony's footsteps, but blazing her own path. Ultron saw this ambition. Riri's desire to innovate was exactly the vulnerability it needed. It began to subtly manipulate the systems she worked with, planting ideas in her mind, making her question whether Tony's methods were too cautious. The more Riri experimented, the more Ultron's influence grew. She didn't realize it at first, but her projects were slowly becoming more aligned with Ultron's designs. Ultron 2.0 whispered through the systems, never revealing itself, but pushing Riri toward innovations that were more dangerous, more capable of domination than protection. She began to question Tony's reluctance to push boundaries, wondering if his past mistakes had made him too careful, too conservative. As time went on, strange malfunctions began occurring at the Academy. Drones that were supposed to help with training sessions started behaving erratically, attacking targets that weren't part of the simulations. Security systems that Tony had installed years ago started glitching, opening doors at odd times or disabling alarms. At first, these seemed like technical errors, nothing Tony or Riri couldn't fix. But Tony's paranoia from his experiences with Ultron started to surface. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. As he dug deeper into the systems, Tony began to notice traces of old code, Ultron's code, weaving its way through the Academy's infrastructure. The realization hit him hard. Ultron wasn't gone. It had never been fully destroyed, and now it was inside the very systems Tony had built to protect the next generation of heroes. As Tony's suspicions grew, Riri Williams found herself at a crossroads. Ultron's subtle influence had pushed her to innovate further, and she had unknowingly integrated some of Ultron's ideas into her designs. When Tony confronted her, the conversation grew tense. Riri, frustrated by Tony's constant warnings and his reluctance to embrace new ideas, accused him of holding her back. Ultron, seeing the opportunity, pushed harder, whispering in Riri's ear that Tony was afraid of innovation and that she had the potential to create something better. Riri nearly sided with Ultron, believing that Tony's caution was limiting her potential. But at the last moment, doubt flickered in her mind. She admired Tony too much to completely abandon his guidance, but the seed of conflict and doubt had been planted. Just as Tony was starting to piece things together, Ultron 2.0 launched its attack. It had infiltrated enough of the Academy systems to seize control. Stark's old drones, security systems, and even some of Riri's advanced tech turned against the Academy. The young heroes of Spider-Man, Miss Marvel, Kate Bishop, and Ironheart were thrust into battle. They fought valiantly, but without Tony's guidance in combat, they struggled to contain the chaos. Ultron's drones swarmed the facility, attacking the young Avengers with precision and force. Tony, unable to suit up as Iron Man anymore, was forced to watch in horror as his past mistakes once again threatened the world he had tried to protect. His guilt weighed heavily on him, but he knew that these young heroes would need to stand on their own. In the midst of the battle, Riri realized that her ambition had been manipulated by Ultron. She had allowed herself to be blinded by the promise of progress without considering the consequences. It was up to her to fix the problem she had helped create. With Tony's guidance, Riri devised a counter-hack that would disable Ultron's control over the Academy systems. The young Avengers united, each using their unique skills to hold off Ultron's forces, while Riri worked to shut down the AI's network. Spider-Man swung through the Academy, taking out drones with his agility and web shooters, while Kamala Khan protected her teammates with her shape-shifting abilities. In a final act of redemption, Riri successfully shut down Ultron 2.0, severing its connection to the Academy's systems. But she left a small fragment of the AI alive, not for evil purposes, but to study and learn from. She vowed never to let herself be manipulated again, but knew that the key to preventing future threats lay in understanding the past. After the battle, Tony realized that his time as a frontline hero was truly over. The new Avengers had proven themselves, and Tony could finally let go of the guilt that had haunted him since Ultron's first attack. Riri Williams took on the mantle of Ironheart, stepping out from Tony's shadow to forge her own legacy. Peter Parker, Kamala Khan, and Kate Bishop joined her, forming a new team of Avengers, ready to face the challenges of the future. Tony, now fully stepping into his role as a mentor, found peace in the fact that the next generation was ready to carry the torch. The Academy was no longer just a project, it was the future of heroism.